This video is an apology to the people of Australia. I'd like to apologise on behalf of British phonetics for some bad transcriptional decisions made here that have ended up causing decided peculiarities in descriptions of Australian English pronunciation. To explain what I mean, we'll start by examining pronunciation up here in the north before we travel south, which gives me an opportunity to show off Aurora Australis in my new web browser. I don't know which theme I like more, this one or Midsummer, which has these addictive ambient sounds. Researching this video has been made much easier and more fun by the new Opera browser. I've spoken about Opera before, but with the reimagined Opera 1 R2 I can do things like this. Open two tabs in the same window thanks to the split screen feature and compare two pages without jumping between tabs or windows.
Target.
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 Game changer.
Getting lost in dozens of tabs is a thing of the past, as you can group related tabs into tab islands. Opera can do this automatically and easily collapse and expand them. And how often have you lost track of the tab you last opened? Now these little underscores or tab traces show you which tabs you opened most recently. All the good stuff in Opera is even better. The built-in music player still has Apple Music, Spotify, etc. and now you can operate it by just hovering over the sidebar icon, move it around and even show it outside the browser. And now I can call up Opera's native AI by typing just Command or Control/. To check all this out, you can of course download the new Opera completely for free by clicking the link in the description down under. Do you see anything strange about this diagram of Australian English monophthongs? Monophthongs, in case you don't know, are steady, unchanging vowels that occupy some point in the vowel space, like R, while diphthongs are vowels with a glide from one area to another, like I. So if this is meant to be a chart of steady monophthongs, what are those gliding diphthongs doing on it? And this table of Australian English vowels in the same Wikipedia article. Why are two monophthongs listed here as diphthongs? As I suggested before, this and a good deal of other weird stuff is our fault. More specifically, it's the fault of RP received pronunciation, the elite accent of the British Empire. And even more specifically, it's the fault of a peculiar and misguided way of transcribing RP. Let's go back to the period of early British presence in Australia. By the 19th century, English, certainly in the south of England, had ended up with a set of 7 closing diphthongs. Here they are as transcribed in 1809 by Thomas Batchelor, and with them the example words that phoneticians use today. The face vowel, for example, popularly known as long A, had been derived primarily from Middle English ah, raised to mid-front position by the great vowel shift and diphthongized to A. The FLEECE vowel, or long E, had been derived primarily from Middle English raised by the great vowel shift to high front position and diphthongized to E. And the GOOSE vowel had been derived primarily from Middle English raised to high position by the great vowel shift and diphthongized in most dialects. Bear in mind that in this kind of transcription, lowercase I and U are used for the short vowels of kit and foot, so E and U could be written like this. This means a relatively small change in quality, but diphthongs nonetheless. The great 19th century phonetician Henry Sweet, who laid the foundations for the International Phonetic Alphabet, wrote the FLEECE and GOOSE vowels like this and called them consonantal diphthongs. From some of his many transcribed passages, here are this and these special attributes, human beings, doing his best to keep off, and prove that he hadn't, and it was a ruined chapel. This way of representing the magnificent 7 closing diphthongs has long been orthodox in American linguistics. Here's Leonard Bloomfield's classic book Language in 1933. In English, successions like ye in yes or we in well are treated as 2 phonemes, like any sequence of consonant plus vowel, but combinations of vowel plus semivowel are treated as compound phonemes. We have 7 such combinations. This view goes right through to the 21st century Atlas of North American English, and many linguists, including myself, have long thought this way. But one place where these 7 vowels have not been represented as a unified group of diphthongs is what I'm going to call 20th century RP-centric phonetics, which has been of relatively little significance in linguistics, but has had vast influence on the general public through dictionaries. This tradition rejected Henry Sweet's consonantal diphthong symbols and transcribed FLEECE and GOOSE as if they belonged with the long monophthongs R, or, Now it's important to understand that these vowels had not stopped being diphthongs. RP was not like Scottish English, for example, where fleece, face, goose and goat are all clearly monophthongs, e, or, u. No, all phonetic descriptions of RP tell you about the diphthongal characteristics of FLEECE and GOOSE. For example, in their description of RP vowels, Hughes, Trudgill and Watt say the vowel usually involves a glide, a transition in quality from I to E. Pronunciation of this vowel without a glide is perceived as affected. And my teacher John Wells, in his 3-volume Accents of English, describes FLEECE as pronounced often with some degree of diphthongization of the E type, particularly in free syllables. In both RP and General American, the general phonetic nature of this vowel could be adequately represented with any of these symbols. The question then is whether to think of it as a diphthong that when compressed can become a relatively short monophthong, which makes sense, or a long monophthong that whenever it is fully long decides to become a closing diphthong, something that true long monophthongs like R and OR never do. As Wells himself points out, FLEECE and GOOSE always pattern with the closing diphthongs. His subdivision of the English vowel system is in complete agreement with that of Labov et al. In the North American Atlas. RP, of course, had these 4 extra vowels. And if you've read my English after RP, you'll know that I follow this well-established subdivision of the vowel system there. And yet, without giving any reasons, Wells conformed to the tradition of transcribing FLEECE and GOOSE phonemically as if they were long monophthongs, like German E and U, even though doing this is a 100% cast-iron guarantee that people the world over will misrepresent this unrelated group of vowels as a natural class, in phonetics courses, in textbooks, and in YouTube videos, because people venerate writing and never read the small print. So how did this RP-centric tradition arise? Why were Henry Sweet's consonantal diphthongs discarded? Well, 2 factors were rather eccentric phonology and snobbery. First, briefly, the phonology. The seminal figure here is Henry Sweet's pupil, Daniel Jones. Jones was a tremendously hard worker with a talent for organising and influencing people that Sweet never had. He founded the Department of Phonetics at UCL, and in an astonishing 2-year period at the end of the First World War, he gave the world his English Pronouncing Dictionary, now in its 18th edition, his Outline of English Phonetics, and the still operating UCL annual summer vacation course in English phonetics. In all 3 cases, the word English basically meant RP, the received British pronunciation of it. This was, remember, the territorial zenith of the British Empire. As I explained in another video, the Australian who introduced Daniel Jones to phonetics was at this very moment arriving in New York, where he would have some influence advocating RP as a standard even for America and the whole world. And Jones had a preoccupation with length. He invented a length phoneme that he called the chroneme. Jones literally believed that kit and fleece had the same vowel phoneme. That's right, he literally believed that ship and sheep contain the same vowel phoneme. The difference, he said, was that words like fleece and sheep have a length chroneme, which he wrote with the length mark. Of course, nobody believes in chronemes anymore, but Jones's influence was such that people kept using his symbols without any knowledge of the chroneme theory behind them. Not that Jones cared too much about justification when it came to symbols. In the opinion of the author, uniformity of method and transcription is so desirable for encouraging the spread of phonetics that such uniformity should be maintained for the present, even at some sacrifice of scientific accuracy. You can see how Jones fostered a tradition of unquestioning acceptance. I'll come back to that unquestioning thing shortly. Before that, we have to look at the socio-phonetics of Victorian England, particularly of London. In the 19th century, class distinctions became clearly drawn in phonetic terms, the upper classes gradually conforming to a single rigid standard of pronunciation, RP, which became a class badge, uniquely prestigious and a barrier to entry, while the lower classes of London spoke Cockney. The differences between RP and Cockney became a set of life-defining shibboleths that kept the classes utterly apart. This is the backdrop for George Bernard Shaw's play Pygmalion, which later became the musical My Fair Lady, in which phonetician Henry Higgins accepts the challenge of teaching RP to a street flower seller, the Cockney Eliza Doolittle. Now, in the original play, Higgins accomplishes this task in the gap between Acts 1 and 2, by the start of which Eliza has already acquired perfect RP, though not yet standard grammar or vocabulary. The transformation itself wasn't dramatised. However, Shaw later wrote a single brief scene depicting just one of the pronunciation lessons. It focuses on one phoneme to highlight the chasm between upper and lower class, a vowel. Can you guess which one? That's right, fleece. In Cockney, as Shaw knew very well, fleece was commonly a wide diphthong beginning in the region of schwa.
A, B, C, D, E.
Stop! Listen to this, Pickering. This is what we pay for as elementary education. This unfortunate animal has been locked up in school for 9 years at our expense to teach her to read and speak the language of Milton and Shakespeare, and the result is I, B, C. And I do think you could possibly say T, not T, mind you. If you say B, C, D again, you will be dragged round this room 3 times by the hair on your head. T, 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 T.
So if maximising the diphthongality of fleece made you irredeemably common, the way to make yourself unmistakably posh was to erase its diphthongality altogether, to affect a pronunciation of total monophthongal purity, like German E. It's exactly this pronunciation that Hughes, Trudgill and Watt were referring to when they said that pronouncing fleece without its glide sounds affected. Hence pronunciations like this from old linguaphone records.
The T of that is pronounced as though it were the first sound of the following syllable. T.
But the day-to-day reality, even in RP, was more diphthongal. Listen to this moment from the 1938 film of Pygmalion, which, by the way, won Shaw an Oscar. Leslie Howard as Higgins at first demonstrates fleece in his normal RP pronunciation, as a diphthong. But then he rams it down Eliza's throat as an emphatic, affected monophthong.
E. 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 E.
We can see the difference between the two pronunciations on spectrograms. The affected monophthong has formants as flat as a pancake.
E. 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 E.
This artificial, affected fleece vowel, desperately squeezing itself into the top left corner of the vowel space to get as far away as possible from those malodorous cockneys, must be what the North American Atlas has in mind when it says, Wells 1982 uses monophthongal symbols for the long high vowels E and Oo, a representation that seems useful for RP. On the other hand, Wells's use of E, Oo for the phonemes of General American is an odd extension of the British system. Perhaps Lebov and his co-authors weren't aware of just how odd E and Oo sound here as well. And so, at last, to Australia, where the impact of London phonetics and socio-phonetics was considerable, as Cox and Fletcher put it in their Australian English pronunciation and transcription. Theories of new dialect formation lead us to believe that Australian English began as a koine, or new dialect, that evolved through contact between speakers of different but mutually intelligible forms of English, of which the southeastern English dialects were the most abundant. And Cox and Palethorpe begin their IPA illustration of the accent with Australian English is a regional dialect of English which shares its phonemic inventory with Southern British English through the historical connection with the dialects of the British Isles, in particular London. So from its earliest days, the Australian colony or colonies were under the thumb of an RP-speaking elite, while the vernacular was heavily influenced by Cockney. Is it any wonder that Australian English, despite being relatively homogeneous, at least among white speakers, has long had the English class system imposed upon it, with the labels cultivated, general and broad, meaning roughly degrees of distance from RP. And when it came to transcription, there wasn't at first any real attempt to transcribe specifically Australian pronunciation at all. The phonemic vowel transcription system traditionally used for Australian English was first proposed by Mitchell in 1946. It was imported from Britain at a time when RP British English was considered to be the standard dialect, albeit an external one, to which Australian English speakers should aspire. Which is why, to this day, Australia's national dictionary, the Macquarie, gives you pronunciations like fleece, goose, face and price. Of course, there have been more accurate descriptions of Australian vowels. A very influential 1997 publication was this acoustic study in the Australian Journal of Linguistics, which looked at a large number of tokens from a body of speakers balanced for age and sex and grouped by the authors into cultivated, general and broad. The principal concern of the present study is to reconsider the acoustic phonetic characteristics of the vowels of contemporary Australian English, as well as the basis for the differentiation of broad, general and cultivated accents. On the basis of their careful measurements, the authors proposed a new set of phonemic symbols for Australian English vowels, which has been used elsewhere. For example, they replace A and I with I and I. However, several old RP symbols survive intact in their proposals, including E for fleece, which is remarkable considering that one of the biggest similarities between vernacular London English and Australian English is what John Wells calls diphthong shift, a counterclockwise shift in the starting points of the fronting-closing diphthongs, in which he includes the vowels of price, face and of course fleece. In cultivated Australian, more or less the same narrow diphthong as RP, E, with a gradual widening of the diphthong as you move from general to broad. So, given that acoustic analysis will inevitably show the diphthongality of the Australian fleece vowel, how could the 1997 acoustic study have missed it? Well, they didn't miss it. It's just that they describe it as a little on-glide to the long monophthong fleece. Here are the reasons they give for this analysis. That's right, none. Nowhere in the entire study is there even a mention of the possibility that fleece is or has ever been considered by anyone to be a diphthong. And this totally unquestioning conformity to the RP-centric view of fleece, this absolute unmentionability of fleece as a diphthong, extends to other publications that adopt the 1997 transcription proposals, such as the IPA illustration of Australian English. The IPA illustration very helpfully provides audio files, and here, with no cherry picking, is the first minimal triplet from the vowel examples that illustrate fleece, face and price.
Bead, bade, bide, bead, bade, bide.
Now, I've looked at these for a long time, and I can't see any reason that you would say the second two are diphthongs and the first one is a monophthong with an on-glide. Bead has more of a steady state at the end than the beginning, and bide has more of a steady state at the beginning than the end. Bade is simply intermediate between the two. Bead has strong energy in the F3, F4 region. Bide has less, with a clear separation of F3 and F4, and again, bade is just intermediate. I've asked non-phoneticians which two of these three pictures they consider to be more similar, and they say the two on the left. bead and bade, which is consistent with fleece and face patterning together in accent after accent, like in Scottish English where they're both monophthongs, e and a, while price is a diphthong. But the revised 1997 transcription system has bade and bide containing diphthongs with the RP-centric monophthong symbol retained for fleece. In other words, their careful acoustic analysis is allowed to tamper with other vowels in the system, but you don't touch fleece. It's as if that upper-class fear and loathing of the smelly proletarian diphthong got transported to Australia along with the convicts. This leads to obvious generalizations being missed. Look at this passage from the IPA illustration. Broad speakers differ from general speakers primarily with respect to the first element of the diphthongs. And a couple of lines later, another vowel that varies systematically with broadness is E as in heed. But as John Wells pointed out, this is obviously one fact, not two, because fleece is obviously one of the diphthongs and its so-called on-glide is obviously its first element. Remember the weird chart from Wikipedia, which is based on the sources I've been mentioning. The fleece diphthong is stuck on the monophthong charts, while face and price, of course, are allowed on the diphthong charts. Now, if we just take the fleece diphthong and put it with face and price on the diphthong chart where it belongs, and then switch from general Australian to broad Australian, voila! Are you trying to tell me that the change in fleece is not the same phenomenon as the change in face and price? The reality, yet again, is that fleece and face in particular behave very similarly. I'm afraid things get worse. It's not just the missed generalizations and the perpetuated guarantee that people will teach fleece as belonging with the long monophthongs, when it doesn't. The unquestioned assumption that fleece and goose, by the way, are monophthongs actually messes up the methodology of the 1997 study. You see, the authors measured what they considered to be diphthongs in open syllables, like hey and ho, but they measured what they considered to be monophthongs in closed syllables, like heed and hood. That's right, they measured fleece and goose in contexts where they were more likely to be monophthongal, not in the open syllables that would have shown their full forms. The consequences of this are even more drastic for goose than for fleece. The study concludes that Australian goose doesn't even have much of a so-called on-glide. And while their proposed new symbol is central rather than back, it's still a long monophthong in the RP-centric tradition. Ooh. But if they'd measured goose in open syllables, they would presumably have encountered at least some pronunciations like these.
Everyone is as fascinated with the coo, coo, coo.
Women can do what men do.
Leading to yet another political coup.
To consider half a century of Doctor Who.
And it's important to note that it was, in fact, a coup.
Talk to the community about what they can do.
When we use a falling-rising intonation pattern, which I discussed in another video, we generally extend the vowel that it's on to accommodate the contour, like so, which can really show off the trajectory of a diphthong. Here's former Governor of Victoria, Linda Dessau, putting this intonation onto the face diphthong and then the goose diphthong.
And I look at today, smart thing to do. Day, do, day, do, day, do, day, do.
And of course, all 7 Australian vowels, including goose, are generally diphthongs when a vowel follows, as in Bloomfield's examples: seeing, saying, buying, boyish, doing, going, bowing. And please understand that in neither American, nor British, nor Australian English are those glides extra inserted sounds, as I explained with measurements in another video. If transcriptions like these were more widespread in the English teaching world, I doubt that anyone would ever have hallucinated the so-called epenthetic linking y and linking w in the first place. This might be a good moment to explain briefly, although it's not absolutely crucial to the main point of the video, why transcribing diphthong glides as glides is better than transcribing them with vowel symbols. People have seen symbols like these so often that many believe a diphthong is any two vowels slapped together, which is not the case. Let's evaluate these two options. Firstly, a glide is non-syllabic, so the transcription on the left can only be one syllable. There's nothing in the transcription on the right that tells you this. You either have to use extra symbols or explain it in the small print. Secondly, glides have lower sonority or loudness than vowels, so the transcription on the left tells you that this form has falling sonority. That's not directly shown in the form on the right, and I'm not sure what it's supposed to mean when you make the first symbol a little superscript like this. Thirdly, and I think most importantly, true diphthongs are tightly constrained. If diphthongs were any two vowels slapped together, languages could have any old combination. But no, true diphthongs fall into a small set of subgroups according to their trajectory. The RP diphthongs famously were front-closing, back-closing or centering. The 7 Australian closing diphthongs, when before another vowel, have only these two trajectories. Appropriately, the IPA provides only a very constrained number of glide symbols. Now, of course, in a narrow transcription, we may definitely want to use vowel symbols to show the exact extent of one diphthong glide or another. But as the 1997 acoustic study itself says, the second target of diphthongs is much more variable than the first and often not attained even in citation form speech. This is why in the Lebov Atlas, front upglides of varying end positions are all identified as y in phonemic notation. Similarly, the back upglides are identified uniformly as w. It's too much detail to put precise endpoints in the kind of broad dictionary transcription used, for example, to teach L2 learners, like the vowel salad in these 1997 proposals, which imply that Australian English has 5 types of diphthong glide, not. In pre-vowel position, Bloomfield's y and w symbols would do fine for Australian English, especially if we carry across the first elements proposed in 1997. Buying, boyish, going, bowing. Frankly, I think broad transcriptions like these would be adequate even when no vowel follows, except perhaps for showing that the glides in goose and goat usually become non-back. Oo, oh.
That thing you dream of doing, the number one thing you can do, doing, do, doing, do, doing, do.
And note how goose and goat behave the same way, patterning together as fleece and face do, contrary to the symbols of the RP-centric tradition. Sigh. Speaking of teaching, clinging to the RP-centric misconception of fleece as a monophthong seems particularly unhelpful for students and learners of Australian English when the near vowel in Australia is monophthongized even more than it is here in England. Let's play Spot the Diphthong. Would you say one of these words has formants that change more than the other two? Well, from the IPA recordings, these are bead, which we saw before, beard and bid.
Bead, bid, bid, bead, bid, bid.
As with fleece, the 1997 proposals leave the RP symbol for near untouched, making these bead, beard and bid. A diphthong flanked by 2 monophthongs, really. So just look at the way bad symbol choice can have one bad consequence after another. Tell everyone that Australian fleece is a monophthong, just like Daniel Jones said, and quite aside from guaranteeing the misteaching of the Australian vowel categories, you end up with diphthongs on monophthong charts and monophthongs in tables of diphthongs. You end up misdesigning your experiments and skewing your data collection. You end up missing generalizations about accent variation and failing to notice how fleece and face pattern together, not to mention goose and goat. You end up with bizarre things like lee, and you end up imagining there are inserted glides where there aren't any. All this for the low, low price of one piece of colonial baggage, an RP symbol that wasn't even right for RP. And I'm willing to take responsibility for all of this. As current director of UCL's summer course in English phonetics, I am in at least one extremely tiny way the inheritor of Daniel Jones's mantle, and in that capacity let me apologise for the Empire's past wrongs. I'm sorry we ditched Henry Sweet's E and OO analysis. I'm sorry we said the RP, FLEECE and GOOSE vowels were monophthongs. That whole chroneme thing...
Clearly mistakes were made.
He's right, mistakes were made.
Nobody in England says FLEECE and GOOSE anymore, and nobody is dragged round the room 3 times by their hair for saying A. Obviously it's your business entirely if you want to keep our head of state, or Photoshop our flag on top of yours. Nothing to do with me. I'm just saying we got FLEECE wrong, and GOOSE. And more seriously than you probably think, I'm sorry.
FLEECE and GOOSE are monophthongs.
FLEECE and GOOSE are monophthongs.